Two, three. Hey everybody, welcome back to Chalkboard History. Franklin version, crash course, 160th anniversary.
There it is, right there.
November 30th, 1864. John Schofield, John Bell Hood, Abraham Lincoln shows up after the battle. No, wait, that's Gettysburg.
Wrong one. Then there's the dominoes.
Earl Van Dorn's already dead. Granberry dies.
Nat Chairs is in prison.
Carter House, never the same.
Emerson Optic saves the day.
Noel Nelson dead.
There he is. Hero.
Emerson Updike,
All on his own.
everybody's hero, in all places, at all times.
The Joshua Chamberlain of the Battle of Franklin.
Joshua Chamberlain's at least kind of cool.
That's true.
Updike. Updike would have an Instagram page where he takes lots of selfies.
He'd be an influencer.
He would be an influencer to influence people to like him. That's what he would be doing. Look at me, everybody. I'm the hero of Franklin. All right, let's talk about what happened almost 160 years ago, and why does it matter?
What did happen almost 160 years ago?
Well, let's see.
On this day, September the 4th. No, November 30th.
John Bell Hood and William Sherman were exchanging scathing letters with one another.
In the name of God and humanity.
Sherman's like, I won. Stop crying about it.
So what happened? Because we talked about this in the Spring Hill one. Franklin's pretty easy to explain. John Schofield gets to Franklin, can't get across the Harpeth River, decides to fight it out there. John Bell Hood shows up, orders them to fight. I mean,
We're going to talk, I think, a little bit more in detail about the armies in a couple of future episodes, because I'm not sure we may have already talked about it by the time you're watching this, because they may come before this in the sequential order of things. Mm-hmm. So it's the 160th, and I was in Spring Hill for the 140th. I'm starting to sound like Bobby Hargrove. Old.
I wonder if we could put... Ooh, let's try that again.
Old.
That sounds good for old.
It sounds like I Dream of Jeannie or something.
It works.
I think what...
it felt right.
What struck me yesterday, because I was thinking about having this conversation today, was that 20 years after the Battle of Franklin, so 1884, you started to see some of the first really detailed accounts from soldiers who had survived it. Mm-hmm. And I just got to thinking that I think for a lot of men, other than just the immediate days and weeks that followed, a lot of these guys never talked about this for almost 20 years. And they finally started to go back to it. And I've lived in this world for 20 years. So what happened? It reminded me how absolutely awful this really was. And the stage of the war. You know, that this was, you've heard me say that the innocence and the naivety was long gone. Yep. This was post-Shiloh, post-Gettysburg, post-Vicksburg, post-Atlanta. One side can see the end might actually be within reach this time. Unlike 63 or 62, they might win it. And the other side still thinks they can win it, but it's that light is fading. We're now almost 2 years after emancipation.
What is it Rohrer says? If we can just last the winter,
victory will be assured us. The noble martyrs, he said they were. And there's a seriousness to this, that which then I go back to, when I visited, when I wrote, and all the things I've seen since I've been here, which has now been, 20 years. But I came here 30 years ago for the first time. Oh my gosh. It's wonderful to see the story simply resurrected, and that people who visit us every day. So we're not really talking about the tactics of it. We're really talking about why this matters, because we're going to hit on that for the anniversary, right?
As we've tried to do for the last several years.
Right. So there's always going to be the nuts and bolts of Schofield arrives, sets up a defensive line, Hood arrives, decides to attack, and it starts.
And they go. Yeah.
And there's this horrific bloodshed. But through many years, I thought, what does 10,000 casualties even mean? What does it mean? And the longer this goes on, the more I think those men, especially the ones who died, whether they died that night or the next day or weeks later or died in POW camps, they had to. They had to die. It's unfortunate that they did, but they had to, because we were at a point in 1961 where we couldn't settle our differences, and I think it's even worse 3.5 years later. The Wilderness and Cold Harbor and Spotsylvania had bled into Atlanta and Peachtree Creek, and then the evacuation of Atlanta, and then that just rolls into Middle Tennessee.
Yeah, it has to have that level of violence, that kind of finality of it.
That's the word, finality.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me last week, why didn't they stop fighting?
They couldn't.
And I said, well, I don't have a perfect answer, because, for I think each individual guy, it's probably a little different. But I know that once the federal troops had sealed off that breach, there were some of them that started killing as many Confederates as they could. Yeah. Because the Confederates wouldn't just surrender.
Right.
I mean, some did, but many would not.
In penny packets, they're still throwing themselves.
Right, they're throwing themselves. They're throwing their muskets. They're swinging them like clubs. They're just like animals. They just won't quit. And so many. It's why one of the Mississippi guys said they were just shooting us down like animals trapped in a pen.
Yeah.
They were leaning over those earthworks and were just laying waste to everybody they could.
I feel like we get it more at, say, Carnton on the battlefield tour than we get it at Carter House, because Carter House, it's pretty steady, a melee until about 8 o'clock or so at night. But over on the eastern side of the battlefield, where Loring's division, where Walthal's division's crossing, they're under artillery fire the entire way there. They're suffering all these awful casualties as they move across the field. And the question almost always comes up, well, why didn't they just stop and try and move over to the center? Why didn't they just stop the fight here and just be done with it? They couldn't. First. Second, where could they have gone? And what could they really have done? Because Loring's out front just being absolutely annihilated. Walthal's out front being absolutely annihilated. And I would say that the fighting over there is done by what, 6 o'clock?
The heaviest stuff is done by 6, yeah. And A.P. Stewart's entire corps, Loring, Walthall, and French, are just wrecked.
Just shattered, yeah.
I mean, there's over 3,000 Confederates killed, wounded, or captured in that narrow area in a pretty short period of time. You just reminded me of a quote I used to tell people on tour. It was from Israel Stiles, and when the federal soldiers got the orders to evacuate, one of them said, "Well, we should just stay here and whip the hell out of them." And the response was, "There's no hell left in them. Can't you hear them praying?" And that has always stuck with me, because when it's dark and the air just smells of that sulfur from the powder, because there wasn't a lot of wind during the day, and once the sun was down, it's just still, and everything it's hanging in the air, and you could hear them out there. You could hear them crying, and you could hear them praying. Isaac Sherwood, way on the other side of the battlefield, closer to Carter House, essentially said that from that moment on, he hated war. As if you couldn't probably hate it already. And because he said you could just hear them out there. He remembered this one particular boy screaming for his mother. And those are the times, on a tour, you can't go, you go too far down that, and some people are just like, oh, it's really heavy stuff. But that is often what especially this time of year, and I think about people like, well, it never should have happened, and how could Hood do this? I don't think Hood had a lot of options.
Yeah.
And then once it starts, it becomes its own thing.
I would say it's like the toothpaste thing, the genie in the bottle. Once you get it out, you can't put it back in. You can't stop it once it's started.
Well, think about 40,000 human beings who have balled up, pent, fierce emotions, fears.
Yep.
Imagine being in a baseball stadium, and if 40,000 people just decided that they wanted to do something, could you stop them?
No. Yeah.
And once these guys got into it, from west of Carter House, past Carter House, all the way to the east side where Carnton is, this just turns into an orgy of just unbelievable human destruction. And I know that that's why so many of the guys really struggled. But also, we've talked a little bit about this myth about, oh, people just wanted to forget it. They couldn't forget it.
Yeah.
And a lot of the guys, as the years went on, like Francis Marion Cockerell, who served for years in the U.S. Senate, they tried to make it a national park because they wanted people to come to Franklin so they could truly get a sense of how the war in the West ended. You know, they never tried as hard to make a national park in Nashville as they did in Franklin.
Yeah.
Franklin seemed to be like the pinnacle for both sides for totally different reasons. They wanted it saved. And I love the fact that so much of the battlefield has now been preserved and people can come and get a sense of truly how dark and serious the Civil War was. And to me, that still is that still is the most important thing, because it's not just about Spring Hill and Franklin. It's not just about Tennessee. This is about the American Civil War and how it finally came to an end and how we've struggled with what it all means years later. So last thoughts on not just the battle, but the 160th and future anniversaries. What does it mean?
Well, I think anniversary moments, particularly the big ones, the 0s and the 5s, always present us with an opportunity to look at time and distance and think about how our thoughts about certain things, about the war, about the Battle of Franklin have evolved and changed. And there may come a time when you're gone and I'm gone and there's 3 or 4 generations of people that come after us that run these sites and that interpret the story here, that the story isn't any longer about just John Bell Hood or just John Schofield. And it's not just about the mechanics of the battle, but about something much larger, about what it means to be on a Civil War battlefield. In the same way that we think of maybe going to a place like Normandy for the Second World War, or we go to those great American Revolutionary War battlefields.
Or why he went to Gettysburg.
Yeah.
He could have given that speech at Franklin.
He could have given that speech from the porch of the White House and it still would have had the same effect.
Right. Because beyond the battle, there is this larger thing at play, which is the survival of the United States and whether we would ever get the chance to mature into the country that we live in today, which, is still a great country. Almost 250 years after it was founded and 160 years after the Battle of Franklin.
So no better place to reflect on that than in these houses or on this battlefield for the 160th anniversary.
Right on. Thanks, everybody.